It's important for us to be very clear that we will respond and defend Turkey if they come under assault from the Russians. Otherwise, the entire NATO alliance comes into question.
I don't believe the Russians have an interest in fighting ISIS. I think it's naive to think they do. And there's nothing they've done on the battlefield so far that would make you believe they're interested in fighting ISIS.
Well, it's been a focus in the 2016 campaign after the Paris attacks. Foreign policy in Iowa. A new poll is shaking up the situation on the ground, where Ted Cruz has picked up significantly in just the past few weeks. There you see Donald Trump still at the lead, but essentially tied with Cruz. Carson falling down, Rubio next. Trump is attacking one of the people who's attacking him, John Kasich.
Kasich is, should I mention it? 3. Not doing, I heard he was dropping out. Somehow, you know, when you're the governor of a state, got to run that state.
Donald Trump on the stump. We're back with the panel. You know, listening to Christie, he thinks he's getting another look in New Hampshire, but you look at these polls, and it's still a dominant situation for Donald Trump, and now Ted Cruz, who has a formidable operation on the ground in Iowa.
Look, I think it's pretty obvious that the two people to watch are Cruz and Rubio. Cruz has made his move. It's obvious that much of that is a result of the fall of Carson. The rise of terrorism abroad has injured two candidates. Last year it was Rand Paul, especially after the beheading of James Foley, which sort of completely revived the issue. And Paul was hurt because of his ideology on intervention and how to deal with terrorism. Carson is now hurt with a renewed interest after Paris because he clearly doesn't know anything about foreign policy, which can be a liability if you're running for the presidency. So as a result of that, he now, I think, is slipping badly. About half of his support went to Trump. Carson had been in the lead in Iowa. So Trump, and I think a lot of it now is going to Cruz. He has a support among evangelicals, but he knows what's going on in the world, and he can speak really well. So I think he's the one who's the initial beneficiary of the Paris events and the fall of Carson. And we'll see how Rubio does. But,
A.B., you look at the internals of our new Fox poll on the questions of immigration, on the questions of migration, Syrian refugees. Some 80% of GOP voters say they line up with Trump. No refugees into the U.S., none into Iowa. The issues seem to line up for him, at least him and maybe Cruz.
Right. Donald Trump's 83% of his support is for pro-deportation Republicans. So the line that he always goes back to works, and it holds his support firm. Talking about not letting refugees in this country is not a strategy for ISIS. It's not a plan for our next commander-in-chief, but it wins him support with the people who he's going to get support from, and he may have a ceiling or he may not. The interesting thing about the Cruz surge is it's not surprising. He's done all the groundwork, as Charles said. He's done a lot of work in the South for the March primaries. He's done it quietly and effectively. He has absorbed Carson's support. He becomes unstoppable if he can start chipping away at Donald Trump. Interesting for Rubio that inside some of that new polling, Cruz is polling so much higher on foreign policy than Marco Rubio. That must be bad news to them. But really the question comes down to Iowa is 10 weeks from yesterday. How much more time is left for Chris Christie, Jeb Bush, these other people, even the Rubio-Cruz rivalry for big turns in the race? If Carson disappears, will Trump? And then who takes that establishment spot and who fights that person who rises from the bottom? We're running out of time.
And is there a sense that that establishment lane will somehow coalesce and say, we have too many people in the race, we need to clear it to have a candidate who can shoot the gap?
One would think. You know, I think that the thing with the Rubio versus Cruz is somehow Rubio has ended up, even though he was a Tea Party candidate when he ran for the Senate, has ended up sort of as this rising establishment type candidate versus Cruz. And so it makes sense to me that Cruz is the one that's rising right now because he has the right tone. He is the angry one in Washington, sticking it to the establishment. And we have to see whether that's going to run its course and people are going to coalesce or not around a Rubio, who I still think is the one to watch.
Yeah, and it all comes down to organization in a place like Iowa.
Right, especially in Iowa. And Cruz has a lot on the ground. And Trump, I'm told, has significant presence there. We'll see, because it's a lot of it I expect will be extremely enthusiastic, although smaller in number.